The hall went silent the moment Alpha King Damian Cross raised his hand and spoke the words that would end everything. Elena Voss stood before the entire pack council, her spine straight, her hands folded in front of her, waiting for a verdict she had feared for 3 long years. "I reject the mate bond between us," Damian said. His voice carried across the stone hall, bouncing off the high windows, reaching every corner where pack members sat frozen in their seats. "Elena Voss is no longer recognized as my intended mate." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a goblet, and the sound of metal against stone rang out like a small explosion in the tense air. Elena did not flinch. She did not gasp. She stood exactly where she had been standing before he spoke, as though the words had passed through her like wind through an open window. Beside Damian, Serafina Vale smiled. She was the daughter of the Redwood Pack's leader, tall and sharp-eyed, dressed in deep red that matched the color of victory. She placed a hand on Damian's arm, claiming her spot at his side, before the announcement had even finished settling into the room. Every eye in the hall turned to Elena, waiting for her to break, waiting for the tears, the trembling lips, the desperate plea that would confirm what everyone assumed about a rejected mate. Instead, Elena lowered her head in a small, graceful bow. "As you wish, Alpha," she said. Her voice did not shake. It did not crack. It was steady, calm, and quiet enough that only the front rows heard it clearly. Then she turned and walked out of the hall. She did not run. She did not stumble. Her footsteps were even and unhurried as she crossed the long stone floor, passed through the heavy wooden doors, and disappeared into the corridor beyond. The doors closed behind her with a soft thud, and the hall remained silent for 3 full seconds before the whispers began. Damian stood at the front of the room, staring at the doors Elena had just walked through. He had expected many things from this moment. He had prepared himself for anger, for tears, for a plea that he would have to firmly refuse in front of his counsel. He had rehearsed his response to all of these outcomes. He had not prepared for silence. Serafina squeezed his arm. "Well," she said, her voice bright with satisfaction, "that went smoothly." Damian did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on the closed doors. 3 years earlier, Elena had arrived at Ashwood Pack as a quiet young woman from a smaller, less influential pack to the north. The bond had formed between her and Damian almost immediately, the way mate bonds sometimes did, without warning, without permission. Damian had felt it the moment their eyes met at a gathering of pack leaders, a pull in his chest, an awareness of her that he could not ignore no matter how he tried. At first, he had welcomed it. He had brought her into his household, introduced her to his council, allowed the pack to believe that she would one day stand beside him as his Luna. Elena had settled into the role with quiet dedication. She learned the names of every pack member. She helped organize the harvest festivals. She sat in on council meetings, offering thoughtful observations when asked, never overstepping, never demanding attention she had not earned. But as the years passed, Damian's advisors grew louder in their warnings. Ashwood Pack was strong, but it was not the strongest. The Redwood Pack, led by Serafina's father, controlled the northern trade routes and commanded twice the warriors Ashwood could muster. An alliance through marriage would secure decades of peace and prosperity. A rejected mate bond, though painful, would heal. Political alliances were forever. Damian had told himself this was wisdom, not weakness. He had told himself that a king's duty came before a king's heart. He had told himself many things in the weeks leading up to the council meeting, and he had believed every one of them until the moment Elena walked out of that hall without a single tear. That night, Damian sat alone in his study, a glass of untouched wine in front of him. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, Elena's steady voice, her calm bow, the sound of her footsteps as she left. He had imagined this moment ending with relief, with the weight of an impossible decision finally lifted from his shoulders. Instead, he felt something heavier settle into his chest, something he could not name. A knock came at his door. His beta, Nathaniel Cole, stepped inside without waiting for an answer, a habit Damian had never bothered to correct. "The council is uneasy," Nathaniel said, closing the door behind him. Some of them respected Elena. They did not expect her to take the news so quietly. "Neither did I," Damian admitted. Nathaniel studied him for a long moment. He had served as Damien's beta since they were young, and he knew his alpha well enough to recognize when something was bothering him beyond the obvious political concerns. You expected her to fight for you. I expected her to react, Damien said. Anyone would react to news like that. Maybe she already made peace with it before you said the words, Nathaniel offered. Maybe she saw this coming long before tonight. Damien did not respond. He stared into his wineglass, unable to shake the image of Elena's calm, unreadable face as she walked away from him. Across the pack grounds, in the small cottage she had called home for the past 3 years, Elena sat on the edge of her bed. She did not cry. She had promised herself long ago that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart, not even in private, not even when no one else could see. She had known this was coming. She had watched the way Damien's advisors whispered in corners whenever she entered a room. She had noticed how his eyes lingered on maps of the northern trade routes during council meetings, how his shoulders tensed whenever Serafina's name came up in conversation. She had felt the distance growing between them for months, long before tonight's announcement made it official. What she had not expected was how empty the moment would feel once it actually happened. She had prepared herself for pain, but she had not prepared for this strange, hollow quiet that now filled her chest, where anticipation used to live. She rose from her bed and began packing. There was no reason to stay in a cottage that belonged to a pack she no longer had a place in. She folded her clothes with careful, deliberate movements, placing them into a single trunk that had traveled with her from her childhood home. She packed slowly, methodically, giving herself something to focus on other than the silence pressing in around her. A soft knock interrupted her. She opened the door to find Grace Whitfield, one of the few friends she had made during her time at Ashwood, standing in the doorway with a worried expression. I heard what happened, Grace said. Elena, I am so sorry. There is nothing to be sorry about, Elena replied, stepping aside to let her friend in. The alpha made his decision. It is done. Grace watched her fold another shirt into the trunk. You are leaving already? Tonight? There is no reason to wait. Elena, Grace reached out and took her hand, stopping her mid-fold. You do not have to pretend with me. I saw you in that hall. I know that could not have been easy. Elena paused. For a brief moment, something flickered across her face. A crack in the calm exterior she had maintained since the moment Damien spoke his rejection. But she pushed it down, the way she had pushed down every difficult feeling since she was a child, learning to survive in a world that rarely gave her the luxury of falling apart. I will be fine, Elena said quietly. I have always been fine. Grace did not look convinced, but she did not push further. She helped Elena finish packing in silence, the two of them working side by side, until the trunk was full and the small cottage stood bare and empty, as though Elena had never lived there at all. The next morning, word had spread through the entire pack. Elena Voss had been rejected by the Alpha King, and instead of weeping or begging, she had walked out with her head held high and began packing her belongings before the sun had even set. The pack members who gathered at the market whispered about her composure, some admiring it, others finding it strange, even unsettling. Damien heard the whispers as he walked through the pack grounds that morning, his guards trailing a respectful distance behind him. He caught fragments of conversation as he passed. She did not even cry. And, I have never seen anyone take rejection like that. And, do you think she truly did not care? That last question lodged itself in Damien's mind and refused to leave. Did she truly not care? He told himself it should not matter. He had made his decision for the good of the pack, and Elena's reaction, whatever it was, should have no bearing on that decision now. And yet he found himself walking toward the edge of the pack grounds, toward the small cottage where Elena had lived, driven by an urge he could not fully explain. He arrived to find the cottage already empty. A single trunk sat outside the door, and Elena stood beside it, waiting for the cart that would carry her belongings away. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Alpha, she finally said, inclining her head in the same measured, respectful gesture she had offered him in the hall the night before. You are leaving, Damien said. It was not a question. There is no reason for me to stay, Elena replied. I no longer have a place here. Where will you go? North, to visit family. Beyond that, I have not decided. Damien studied her face, searching for some crack in her composure, some sign of the devastation he had expected to find. He found nothing but calm, steady eyes looking back at him, waiting patiently for him to finish whatever it was he had come to say. "I wanted to make sure you were being treated fairly," he said finally, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were not the reason he had come. "The pack will provide for your travel and settlement, as is proper." "That is generous of you, Alpha," Elena said. "Thank you." The cart arrived, driven by one of the pack's younger warriors. Elena helped load her trunk onto the back, refusing the driver's offer of assistance with a polite shake of her head. Damien stood watching, feeling strangely rooted to the spot, unable to find any further words that made sense to say. Elena climbed onto the cart and settled herself for the journey. Before the driver could snap the reins, she looked back at Damien one final time. "I hope the Alliance brings your pack everything you hoped for," she said. There was no bitterness in her voice, no hidden edge of sarcasm. It sounded, impossibly, like she meant it. Then the cart pulled away, carrying her down the long road that led out of Ashwood territory, and Damien stood alone at the edge of the pack grounds, watching until the cart disappeared from sight. He did not understand the feeling that settled into his chest as he watched her go. It was not relief, though he had expected relief. It was something closer to loss, though he told himself that made no sense. He had been the one to end things. He had been the one to choose Serafina and the alliance she represented. He had no right to feel anything close to loss. And yet, as he turned and walked back toward the pack hall, the feeling followed him, settling deep into his chest, like a stone he could not shake loose, growing heavier with every step he took away from the empty cottage and the road Elena had disappeared down. That evening, Serafina found him in his study once again, the same untouched glass of wine sitting in front of him that had been there the night before. "You look troubled," she observed, taking a seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Is something wrong?" "No," Damien said, though the word felt hollow even as he spoke it. "Nothing is wrong." Serafina studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You are thinking about her." Damien did not answer, which was answer enough. "She is gone now," Serafina said, her voice carrying a note of impatience she did not bother to hide. "You made your choice. There is no reason to keep thinking about a woman who no longer has any place in your life." "I know that," Damien said. "Then stop thinking about her." But that night, long after Serafina had left his study, and the pack hall had fallen quiet, Damien sat alone with his wine, staring at the door Elena had walked through, and found that he could not stop thinking about her, no matter how hard he tried. Her calm voice echoed in his mind, her steady eyes. The complete absence of tears that should have felt like relief, but instead felt like a wound he could not name, could not explain, and could not, no matter how he tried, make disappear. Somewhere on the northern road, Elena rode in silence, watching the pack grounds she had called home for 3 years shrink behind her until they vanished completely from view. She did not look back again. She kept her eyes forward, toward whatever came next, refusing to let herself wonder what Damien might be thinking, refusing to let herself hope that the ache in her chest meant anything at all, beyond the simple truth that some losses hurt no matter how calmly you carried them. The road stretched on ahead of her, long and uncertain, and for the first time in 3 years, Elena Voss belonged to no one but herself. 3 weeks passed, and Elena settled into a small house on the edge of her uncle's land, far north of Ashwood territory. The house was modest, with a single room for sleeping and another for cooking, but it was hers, free of any pack politics or expectations that had shaped her life for the past 3 years. She spent her mornings tending a small garden and her afternoons helping her uncle's family with their trade in woven goods, slowly building a quiet, ordinary life for herself. She did not speak of Damien. When her aunt asked gentle questions about what had happened at Ashwood, Elena answered them briefly and changed the subject. She had decided, somewhere on that long northern road, that she would not let the rejection define the rest of her life. She would grieve in private, if she grieved at all, and she would not let anyone see the cracks she refused to acknowledge even existed. But grief has a way of finding cracks whether we acknowledge them or not. Late at night, when the house was quiet, and her uncle's family had long since gone to sleep, Elena would sometimes find herself staring at the ceiling, unable to rest, her mind circling back to the moment Damien had spoken his rejection in front of the entire council. She did not cry during these late hours either. She had trained herself too well for that, but she felt the weight of what she had lost pressing against her chest, and she wondered, in the darkest hours before dawn, whether her composure had been a strength or simply another way of hiding from a pain too large to face directly. Back at Ashwood, the pack had not forgotten Elena as quickly as Damien had hoped they would. Her name still surfaced in conversations at the market, in the training yard, among the council members who had watched her serve the pack faithfully for 3 years without complaint. Some spoke of her with admiration, calling her composure a sign of true strength. Others spoke with confusion, wondering how anyone could walk away from a broken mate bond without shedding a single tear. Damien heard these conversations more often than he wanted to. He found himself listening for her name whenever he walked through the pack grounds, and each time he heard it, that same heavy feeling settled into his chest, refusing to loosen its grip no matter how many hours passed. Serafina noticed his distraction almost immediately. She had moved into the pack hall shortly after the council announcement, taking up residence in quarters near Damien's own, and she made it clear through both words and actions that she expected to be treated as his intended mate, in all but name, until the formal ceremony could be arranged. "You barely speak during council meetings anymore," she said one evening, watching him from across the dining hall as servants cleared away the remains of their meal. "You used to have opinions on every matter brought before the council. Now you simply nod along with whatever your advisors suggest." "I am considering matters carefully," Damien said. "That is all." "Is it?" Serafina's tone sharpened, though her expression remained composed. "Or are you still distracted by a woman who no longer has any claim on your attention?" Damien did not answer immediately, and his silence told Serafina everything she needed to know. "You rejected her," Serafina continued, leaning forward slightly. "You chose the alliance between our packs over a mate bond you claimed meant nothing beyond duty. If that was true, Damien, then her absence should not weigh on you at all." "It does not weigh on me," Damien said, though the words felt false even as he spoke them. Serafina studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. She did not press further, but the doubt she had planted lingered in the air between them, long after she rose from the table and left the hall. Damien found little peace in the weeks that followed. Council meetings that had once flowed smoothly now felt strained, as advisors noticed their alpha's distracted silences and exchanged worried glances when they thought he was not looking. Nathaniel, ever loyal, tried more than once to raise the subject directly. "You have not been yourself since Elena left," Nathaniel said one afternoon, as the two of them walked the perimeter of the pack grounds, checking on the border patrols. "The pack notices these things, Damien, whether you want them to or not." "I am handling the responsibilities of leading this pack," Damien said. "That has not changed." "That is not what I mean, and you know it." Nathaniel stopped walking, forcing Damien to stop as well. "You rejected her because you believed it was the right choice for Ashwood. I do not doubt that you believed it at the time, but watching you these past weeks, I have started to wonder if you believed it for the right reasons, or if you simply told yourself what you needed to hear to avoid a truth you were not ready to face." Damien's jaw tightened. "What truth would that be?" "That you were afraid," Nathaniel said simply. "A true mate bond asks everything of you. It asks you to be vulnerable, in ways that political alliances never will. Serafina offers you power and security, without ever asking you to open your heart to her. Elena asked for nothing but your honesty, and that terrified you more than any threat from a rival pack ever could." Damien said nothing. He turned and continued walking along the border, leaving Nathaniel's words hanging in the cold afternoon air behind him, though he could not shake them loose no matter how far he walked. That night, unable to sleep, Damien found himself standing outside the empty cottage where Elena had once lived. The pack had not yet assigned it to anyone new, and it sat quiet and dark at the edge of the grounds, a hollow reminder of everything that had changed in the span of a single council meeting. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cottage had been cleared of Elena's belongings, but faint traces of her remained. A small dried flower pressed between two stones on the windowsill, a chip in the wooden floor near the hearth where she had once dropped a heavy pot while cooking, laughing at her own clumsiness in a rare, unguarded moment he had witnessed months before everything fell apart between them. Damien sat down at the small wooden table where Elena used to take her meals, and for the first time since the night of the council meeting, he allowed himself to sit with the full weight of what he had done. He had told himself, over and over, that rejecting Elena was an act of strength, a sacrifice made for the good of his pack. Sitting alone in her empty cottage, surrounded by the faint remnants of a life she had built here, he began to wonder if it had actually been an act of cowardice, dressed up as duty to make it easier to swallow. He thought of her steady voice in the council hall, her calm bow, the absence of tears that had unsettled him more than any display of grief could have. He had spent weeks telling himself that her composure meant she did not care, that the mate bond had never mattered as deeply to her as it had briefly threatened to matter to him. But sitting in her empty cottage now, he began to understand a different possibility, that her silence had not been indifference at all, but the deepest kind of pain, carried so carefully that it left no visible trace behind. Meanwhile, in the north, Elena continued building her quiet life, unaware of the storm slowly gathering in the heart of the man who had once claimed to reject her without hesitation. She spent her days working alongside her uncle's family, learning the trade of weaving, finding small moments of peace in the rhythm of ordinary work. Occasionally, travelers passing through mentioned news from the southern packs, and Elena would listen with carefully controlled interest, gathering fragments of information about Ashwood, without ever asking directly. She heard that the alliance between Ashwood and Redwood had been formally announced, that plans for a mating ceremony between Damien and Serafina were already underway. She heard this news standing in the market, a basket of woven goods balanced on her hip, and she felt something inside her chest tighten painfully before she forced herself to breathe evenly and continue on with her errands, as though the news meant nothing at all. That night, alone in her small house, Elena allowed herself, for the first time since leaving Ashwood, to sit with the full truth of what she had lost. She had told herself for weeks that she was fine, that her composure in the council hall had been a genuine reflection of her acceptance, rather than a mask carefully constructed to hide a devastation too large to show anyone, including herself. But sitting alone in the dark, hearing confirmation that Damien's future with Serafina was already being planned, she finally allowed the tears she had refused to shed in front of the entire pack council to fall, quiet and unwitnessed, in the privacy of her own small home. She cried for the life she had imagined building at Ashwood. She cried for the mate bond she had felt so certain of, only to watch it dismissed in front of an entire hall of witnesses. She cried, most of all, for the version of herself who had believed, foolishly perhaps, that loyalty and quiet devotion would be enough to secure a place in someone's heart, only to learn that political ambition would always weigh heavier in the scales of a king's decisions. By morning, she had composed herself once again. She rose, tended her garden, and continued the quiet life she had begun building for herself, carrying her grief privately, the way she always had, refusing to let it show on the surface, where anyone else might see. Neither Elena nor Damien knew, in those quiet weeks following the rejection, how deeply the choice made in that council hall would continue to unravel the lives of everyone connected to it. The alliance between Ashwood and Redwood had been announced, but announcements were easier made than kept, and beneath the surface of celebration and political triumph, cracks were already beginning to form, cracks that would eventually bring Damien and Elena back into each other's lives, in ways neither of them could yet imagine. 2 months into the alliance, the first true cracks began to show. Serafina, now settled fully into her role beside Damien, had grown increasingly comfortable making decisions on behalf of the pack, without consulting him first. She reassigned trade agreements that had taken Ashwood's council years to negotiate, replacing them with terms that heavily favored Redwood's merchants. She dismissed 2 of the pack's longtime advisors, replacing them with her own people from Redwood, claiming they would serve the new alliance more effectively. Damien discovered these changes not through Serafina herself, but through Nathaniel, who brought the news to him with visible frustration. She reassigned the eastern trade route without bringing it before the council, Nathaniel said, dropping a stack of documents onto Damien's desk. This affects every merchant family that depends on that route for their livelihood, and she did not think it necessary to discuss it with you first. Damien read through the documents in silence, his frustration building with every line. "Bring Serafina to my study," he said finally. "Now." When Serafina arrived, she showed no sign of concern about being summoned. She settled into a chair across from Damien's desk, with the same easy confidence she carried into every room. "You reassigned the Eastern trade route," Damien said, sliding the documents toward her. "Without consulting me. Without bringing it before the council." "It needed to be done quickly," Serafina replied, unbothered. "My father's merchants were prepared to offer better terms, and waiting for a council vote would have cost us the opportunity." "That is not how decisions are made in this pack," Damien said, his voice hardening. "Every trade agreement passes through council review. That has been the standard for generations." Serafina's expression shifted, the easy confidence giving way to something colder. Perhaps it is time Ashwood's standards evolved to match the strength of this new alliance. "My father did not agree to this arrangement so that his daughter could sit quietly, while outdated traditions slowed necessary progress. This is still my pack," Damien said, "and these decisions still require my approval." "For now," Serafina said, rising from her chair. The words hung in the air with a quiet threat that Damien did not fail to notice. After she left, Damien sat alone in his study, staring at the documents in front of him, the weight of what he had chosen settling more heavily onto his shoulders with each passing day. He had told himself that this alliance would bring stability and strength to Ashwood. Instead, he was beginning to see, with growing clarity, that he had traded one kind of vulnerability for another, a mate bond that asked for his honesty, replaced by a political partnership that seemed increasingly determined to strip away his authority piece by piece. Word of the tension between Damien and Serafina began to spread through the pack, whispered in corners much the same way rumors of Elena's departure had spread months before. The council members, uneasy with Serafina's growing influence, began meeting privately, expressing concerns that had been building since the day of her arrival. "She treats this pack as though it already belongs to Redwood," one elder observed during a private gathering Damien was not present for. "I fear we have traded a devoted Luna for a conqueror wearing the mask of an ally." The comparison, once spoken, spread quickly through the pack, and it was not long before Damien heard the whispers himself. He found himself, more than once, standing at the edge of the pack grounds near Elena's empty cottage, wondering how different things might have been had he chosen differently that night in the council hall. Meanwhile, in the north, Elena's quiet life had begun attracting attention of its own. Callum Hart, the young beta of a neighboring pack that traded regularly with her uncle's family, had taken notice of her during his visits to the market. He was steady and kind, with an easy laugh and none of the political weight that had defined her years at Ashwood. Over several weeks, he found reasons to linger near her stall, offering help with her deliveries, asking gentle questions about her weaving that gradually gave way to questions about her life before she arrived in the north. Elena did not tell him everything. She spoke only briefly of Ashwood, describing it as a chapter of her life that had ended, without offering the details of how painfully it had closed. Callum did not press her for more, and she found herself grateful for his patience, for the way he seemed content to know her as she was now, rather than demanding to understand everything she had been before. Their friendship grew slowly, built on shared laughter during market days and quiet conversations as the sun set over her uncle's fields. Callum began courting her openly by early summer, bringing small gifts when he visited, walking her home after long days at the market, making his intentions known without pressure or urgency. Elena found herself, for the first time since leaving Ashwood, allowing herself to imagine a future that did not revolve around the pain of what she had lost. Word of Callum's courtship eventually reached Ashwood, carried south by traveling merchants, who had witnessed the growing closeness between the beta and the woman once known as Elena Voss. The news reached Damien through an offhand comment from one of his advisors during a council meeting, mentioned so casually that the advisor had no idea of the effect it would have. "I heard the Voss woman has taken up with a beta from the northern trade packs," the advisor said, shuffling through papers as he spoke. "Seems she has settled in nicely up there." Damien said nothing, but something inside his chest tightened with a force that surprised him. He told himself it should not matter. Elena was no longer his mate. She was free to build whatever life she chose, with whomever she chose, and he had no right to feel anything about that choice beyond distant well-wishing. But that night, alone in his study, Damien found himself unable to focus on anything beyond the image of Elena, walking beside another man, laughing at things this stranger said, allowing herself the kind of open happiness she had always kept so carefully guarded during her years at Ashwood. The jealousy that gripped him was sudden and fierce, entirely unreasonable given the circumstances he himself had created, and yet it refused to loosen its hold no matter how firmly he reminded himself that he had no claim left on her heart. He found himself days later inventing a reason to travel north, a trade dispute along the border that required his personal attention, though in truth, any of his advisors could have handled the matter easily. Nathaniel, recognizing the excuse for what it was, said nothing as he prepared to accompany his alpha on the journey, though the knowing look in his eyes made clear he understood exactly what was drawing Damien north. They arrived in the small trading town near Elena's uncle's land on a warm afternoon, the market bustling with activity. Damien spotted her almost immediately, standing behind a stall of woven goods, her hair catching the afternoon sunlight as she laughed at something Callum said beside her. The sight struck Damien harder than he expected. She looked lighter than he remembered, freer somehow, as though the weight she had carried during her years at Ashwood had finally begun to lift from her shoulders. He watched as Callum reached out and gently touched her arm, and Elena did not pull away. Damien approached the stall under the pretense of examining her goods, though both he and Elena understood immediately that this was no chance encounter. "Alpha Cross," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral as she noticed him standing before her stall. "This is unexpected." "I am here regarding a border matter," Damien said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I did not realize this was the town you had settled in." "It was not exactly a secret," Elena replied, though there was no accusation in her tone, only the same calm composure she had carried since the night of the council meeting months before. Callum stepped forward, extending a friendly hand. "Callum Hart," he said. "I do not believe we have met, Alpha Cross." Damien shook his hand, forcing his expression to remain neutral, despite the tightness building in his chest. "You are courting Elena," he said, the words coming out more directly than he intended. "I am," Callum said, unbothered by the bluntness of the question. There was no challenge in his voice, only simple honesty. "She is a remarkable woman." "She is," Damien agreed quietly, the words feeling heavier than he expected, as he watched Elena's expression remain carefully composed, giving nothing away about whatever she might be feeling, as the two men who represented such different chapters of her life stood before her, taking each other's measure. Elena excused herself shortly after, citing the need to attend to other customers, though Damien suspected the excuse was as much about creating distance as it was about genuine business. He watched her walk away, moving through the market with the same graceful composure she had always carried, and felt, more strongly than he had allowed himself to feel in months, the full weight of everything he had thrown away in that council hall. He returned to Ashwood 2 days later, the border matter resolved quickly, once he finally turned his attention to it, though his mind remained fixed on the image of Elena, laughing beside Callum Hart, allowing herself an openness she had never shown during her years by Damien's side. The jealousy that had gripped him in the market had not faded during the journey home. If anything, it had grown sharper, more insistent, refusing to let him rest, as he tried to reconcile the choice he had made with the ache that choice continued to leave behind. Back at Ashwood, Serafina's grip on the pack's affairs had tightened further during his absence. He returned to find 3 more advisors dismissed, replaced with Redwood loyalists who answered to Serafina's father more readily than they answered to him. The council, once a body Damien had trusted to guide the pack's affairs alongside him, had become fractured, divided between those loyal to Ashwood's traditions and those who had begun quietly currying favor with the growing influence of Redwood. Damien understood, standing once again in his study surrounded by the mounting evidence of what his political marriage was costing him, that the alliance he had chosen over Elena was beginning to threaten the very stability he had sacrificed her to protect. And somewhere beneath that growing understanding, a quieter, more painful truth continued to surface, that even if the alliance had brought Ashwood every benefit he had once hoped for, it would never have filled the space Elena's absence had left behind. The trouble that had been quietly building beneath the surface of the Ashwood and Redwood alliance finally broke into the open on a cold autumn morning, when scouts arrived at the pack hall with news that shook the entire council. A group of armed raiders had crossed into Ashwood's eastern territory, burning 2 grain storehouses and injuring several pack members who had tried to defend the border. The raiders wore no pack markings, but the scouts reported hearing them speak in the dialect common to the far eastern territories, a region that had long harbored resentment toward both Ashwood and Redwood for controlling the most valuable trade routes in the region. Damien called an emergency council meeting within the hour. Serafina, seated beside him as she always insisted on being during official gatherings, seemed less concerned with the raid itself than with what it might mean for the trade agreements her father had negotiated. This could disrupt the entire eastern route, she said, her voice tight with frustration rather than fear. My father will not be pleased if this delays the shipments already promised to our merchants. 2 pack members are currently being treated for injuries, Damien said, his patience thinning. That concerns me a great deal more than delayed shipments. Serafina's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, though the exchange did not go unnoticed by the council members seated around them. Nathaniel returned from a scouting mission 2 days later, with more troubling news. The raiders had not acted alone. Evidence suggested they had received support from someone within Redwood's own territory, someone with enough influence to supply weapons and coordinate the timing of the attack to coincide with a period when Ashwood's eastern defenses were weakest. You believe someone within Redwood orchestrated this, Damien said, studying the evidence Nathaniel had gathered. I believe it is possible, Nathaniel said carefully, and if it is true, it raises troubling questions about how deeply this alliance actually serves Ashwood's interests, or whether it has simply made us more vulnerable to those who see an opportunity in the chaos of a new, untested partnership. Damien confronted Serafina with the evidence that evening, watching her reaction carefully as he laid out what Nathaniel had discovered. For the first time since her arrival at Ashwood, something like genuine unease crossed her features. My father would not authorize an attack against his own alliance partner, she said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Perhaps not authorize, Damien said, but perhaps someone close to him saw an opportunity to weaken Ashwood before the alliance fully solidified, believing it would strengthen Redwood's position when the terms were eventually renegotiated. Serafina did not deny the possibility outright, and her silence told Damien everything he needed to know about the fractures that ran even deeper within the alliance than he had previously realized. The partnership he had chosen over Elena, the one he had told himself would secure Ashwood's future, was proving instead to be built on foundations far less stable than anyone had promised him. News of the raid and the growing tension between Ashwood and Redwood eventually reached the northern trading town, carried by merchants who had witnessed the disrupted shipments firsthand. Elena heard the news while working at her stall, and despite the months that had passed since her rejection, she felt an immediate, instinctive concern for the pack that had once been her home, for the people she had come to know during her years there, regardless of how things had ended between her and their alpha. That evening, she found herself unable to focus on her usual tasks, her mind circling back again and again to what she had heard. She thought of the pack members she had grown close to during her years at Ashwood, wondering if any of them had been among those injured in the raid. She thought, despite her best efforts not to, of Damien, wondering how he was managing the crisis, wondering if the alliance he had chosen over her was truly proving to be the source of strength he had believed it would be. Callum noticed her distraction when he arrived that evening for their usual walk. You seem troubled, he said gently. I heard news from the south, Elena admitted. There has been trouble at Ashwood, a raid on their eastern border. Callum studied her carefully. You still care about what happens there. I care about the people, Elena said. That does not simply disappear because of how things ended. Callum nodded, though something in his expression suggested he understood there was more to her concern than simple compassion for people she had once known. He did not press the matter further, but the conversation lingered between them for the rest of the evening, a quiet reminder that Elena's heart, however carefully guarded, had not fully closed the door on the life she had left behind. 3 days later, a messenger arrived at Elena's uncle's home, carrying an urgent request from Ashwood. The pack's healer, overwhelmed by the number of injured warriors from the ongoing border skirmishes, had fallen ill herself and desperately needed additional hands trained in herbal medicine and wound care. Elena's skills, developed during her years serving Ashwood's household and later refined during her time in the north, made her one of the few people within reasonable traveling distance capable of providing meaningful help. Elena read the request twice, her hands trembling slightly as she considered what answering it would mean. Returning to Ashwood meant facing Damien again, facing the pack that had watched her walk away with such careful composure months before. It meant stepping back into a world she had worked hard to leave behind. But it also meant people were suffering, people she had once cared for deeply, and Elena had never been the kind of person who could turn away from someone in need simply because helping them came at a personal cost. She made her decision within the hour, packing a bag of medical supplies and herbs she had gathered over the years. Callum offered to accompany her, but Elena gently declined, explaining that this was something she needed to face on her own terms. He did not argue, though the concern in his eyes lingered as he watched her prepare for the journey south. Elena arrived at Ashwood 2 days later, traveling with a small escort provided by her uncle. The pack grounds looked much as she remembered, though a heaviness hung in the air that had not been present during her years there. She made her way immediately to the healer's quarters, setting to work without pausing to seek out anyone else, focusing entirely on the injured warriors who needed her attention. Word of her arrival spread quickly through the pack. By the time Damien heard the news, Elena had already spent hours tending to the wounded, moving between cots with the same quiet, focused competence she had always brought to every task she undertook at Ashwood. Damien found her in the healer's quarters late that evening, kneeling beside a young warrior whose injured leg she was carefully wrapping in fresh bandages. She did not look up immediately, focused entirely on her work, and Damien found himself standing silently in the doorway, watching her with an ache in his chest that he no longer tried to deny. "You came back," he said finally. Elena finished securing the bandage before looking up at him. "Your healer needed help. I was in a position to provide it." "You did not have to." "No," Elena agreed. "I did not have to. I chose to." The simplicity of her answer struck Damien more deeply than any elaborate explanation could have. She had chosen to return, despite everything that had happened between them, because the people here needed help, and she had the ability to provide it. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of quiet, selfless strength that had drawn him to her in the first place, 3 years earlier, long before politics and pressure had convinced him to throw it away. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for coming back." Elena rose to her feet, wiping her hands on a clean cloth. "I did not come back for you, Damien," she said, using his name directly for the first time since her rejection, the informality striking him with unexpected force. "I came back for them." She gestured toward the injured warriors filling the room. "Do not mistake my presence here for anything more than that." Damien nodded, though something in her voice, some small crack in the careful composure she had maintained since the moment she left, told him that perhaps things were not quite as simple as she wanted him to believe. He said nothing further, allowing her to return to her work, but he found himself lingering in the doorway a moment longer than necessary before finally turning and walking away, his mind churning with everything her return had stirred loose inside him. Over the following days, Elena worked tirelessly alongside the pack's recovering healer, tending to the wounded and helping organize better defenses for the eastern border. She interacted with Damien only when necessary, keeping their conversations brief and focused entirely on practical matters. But Damien noticed, in the quiet moments when she believed no one was watching, a weariness in her eyes that went beyond simple physical exhaustion, a heaviness that suggested the composure she wore so carefully was costing her more than she ever let anyone see. One evening, as Elena prepared herbal remedies in the healer's small workroom, Damien found himself drawn there once again, unable to stay away despite every reasonable argument telling him he should. He watched her work in silence for several minutes before finally speaking. "I have been thinking about that night," he said quietly. "The council meeting, the things I said." Elena did not pause in her work, though her shoulders tensed slightly. "There is no need to revisit it, Alpha. What is done is done." "I do not think that is entirely true," Damien said. I think I made a mistake, Elena. A mistake I have been trying to convince myself was wisdom for months now. Elena finally stopped, setting down the herbs she had been grinding, and turned to face him fully for the first time since their conversation began. Her expression, usually so carefully guarded, showed the smallest crack of raw emotion, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough to escape his notice. "Do not do this," she said quietly. "Do not stand here and tell me you regret it now, after everything, after I have spent months rebuilding a life for myself that does not depend on your approval or your affection." "I am not asking you to depend on anything," Damien said. "I am simply telling you the truth. Rejecting you was not an act of strength, Elena. It was fear, dressed up as duty, and I have spent every day since that night regretting it more deeply than I know how to explain." Elena's composure finally slipped, just slightly, just enough for Damien to see the pain he had caused reflected clearly in her eyes before she forced it back down, hidden once again behind the careful control she had perfected since the night he first spoke his rejection, in front of the entire council. It devastated him more deeply than any tears ever could have, seeing proof at last that her silence had never meant indifference, only a strength born from necessity, carrying a wound she had refused to let anyone witness. "You do not get to say that to me now," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Not after everything, not when you have someone waiting for you in the pack hall who expects to become your Luna." "Serafina is not my choice," Damien said. "She never truly was. I chose her because I was afraid of what loving you fully would demand of me, and I have paid for that fear every single day since." Elena said nothing for a long moment, the workroom filled with a silence heavier than any words could have carried. Finally, she turned back to her herbs, resuming her work with hands that trembled just slightly more than before. "I need time," she said quietly. "Time to understand what any of this means, if it means anything at all. You cannot simply undo months of pain with a single conversation, Damien." "I know," Damien said. "I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I am only asking you to know the truth, whatever you choose to do with it." He left the workroom shortly after, allowing Elena the space she had asked for, though the conversation lingered heavily between them in the days that followed, a fragile thread connecting two people who had once believed, with complete certainty, that their bond had been broken beyond any hope of repair. The days following their conversation in the healer's workroom passed with a strange, uneasy tension settling over the pack hall. Elena continued her work tending the wounded, though she found herself more careful than ever to avoid moments alone with Damien, uncertain of what she truly felt beneath the careful composure she had spent months rebuilding. Damien, for his part, found himself equally unsettled, torn between the truth he had finally spoken aloud and the political reality of the alliance he had built with Serafina, an alliance that could not simply be undone without consequences that would ripple far beyond his own heart. Those consequences arrived sooner than anyone expected. A week after Elena's return, scouts brought word that a larger force was massing along Ashwood's eastern border, far larger than the raiding party that had struck weeks before. This was no opportunistic raid. This was an organized attack, led by a coalition of smaller packs from the eastern territories who had grown resentful of the trade dominance held by both Ashwood and Redwood for generations. They had watched the tension between the two allied packs with interest, recognizing an opportunity to strike while both sides remained distracted by their own internal fractures. Damien called every available warrior to the border, preparing Ashwood's defenses as thoroughly as time allowed. Serafina, to her credit, sent word requesting reinforcements from Redwood, though the response that came back was slower and smaller than the alliance had promised, a clear sign that her father's commitment to Ashwood's defense was far less solid than the original treaty had suggested. "They are testing us," Nathaniel said grimly, studying the reports that continued arriving from the border, watching to see if the alliance holds, or if Ashwood stands alone when trouble truly arrives. Elena, despite having no obligation to remain during a conflict that no longer concerned her directly, chose to stay, setting up a field station near the border to treat warriors as they fell wounded in the growing skirmishes. Her presence there was not lost on Damien, who found himself, in the chaos of preparing for what threatened to become a full battle, drawing strength from the knowledge that she had chosen, once again, to stand beside his pack when it needed her most. The attack came at dawn 3 days later. The Eastern Coalition struck with more force than Ashwood's scouts had anticipated, overwhelming the first line of defense before Damien's warriors could fully organize their response. Damien fought at the front lines alongside his most trusted warriors, pushing back against the initial surge, while Nathaniel worked to rally the remaining forces into a more coordinated defense. The battle raged for hours, the Eastern Coalition's numbers nearly matching Ashwood's own, made worse by the thin reinforcements Redwood had provided. At the height of the fighting, Damien found himself separated from his main force, surrounded by 3 enemy warriors who had recognized him as the pack's alpha and seen an opportunity to end the conflict decisively by striking down its leader. He fought fiercely, but the numbers against him were significant, and a blow from behind sent him to the ground, momentarily stunned as his attackers closed in for what could have been a fatal strike. It was Elena who reached him first. She had been moving through the chaos of the battlefield, tending to fallen warriors wherever she could reach them, when she saw Damien go down. Without hesitation, she grabbed a fallen warrior's spear and rushed toward him, driving off the nearest attacker with a strike that caught him off guard, buying Damien the precious seconds he needed to recover and rise back to his feet. Fighting side by side for the first time, Damien and Elena pushed back the remaining attackers together, his strength combined with her fierce determination proving more than a match for the warriors who had thought they found an easy victory. By the time Nathaniel and the reorganized forces arrived to reinforce their position, the immediate threat had been neutralized, and the tide of the larger battle began, slowly, to turn in Ashwood's favor. The Eastern Coalition retreated by midday, having suffered losses far greater than they had anticipated. Their assumption that a weakened, divided Ashwood would fall, easily proven entirely wrong. As the pack's warriors began the exhausting work of tending the wounded and securing the border against further attacks, Damien found Elena near the field station, her hands stained with the work of treating countless injuries throughout the long, brutal day. "You saved my life," he said quietly, approaching her as she finished bandaging a young warrior's arm. "I did what needed to be done," Elena said, though the exhaustion in her voice could not fully mask the relief she felt at seeing him alive and standing before her. "The same as I would have done for any warrior on that field." "Elena," Damien reached out, gently taking her hand before she could turn away. "You know that is not entirely true." Elena's eyes met his, and for the first time since her return to Ashwood, she did not try to hide the emotion visible there. "I was terrified," she admitted quietly. "When I saw you go down, I was more afraid than I have ever been in my life, and I did not stop to think about anything except reaching you in time." The admission hung between them, fragile and honest, stripped of the careful composure both of them had relied on for months to survive the pain of everything that had happened. Around them, the pack continued its exhausted work of recovery, but for a brief moment, neither Damien nor Elena noticed anything beyond the truth, finally spoken clearly between them. That evening, as the pack gathered to tend their wounded and mourn those lost in the day's fighting, Serafina approached Damien in the aftermath of the battle, her expression tight with a mixture of frustration and something closer to genuine concern that Damien had rarely seen from her before. "Redwood's reinforcements were too slow," she said quietly. "My father made promises he did not fully intend to keep, using this alliance to weaken Ashwood's position while appearing supportive on the surface. I did not fully understand his intentions when I agreed to this arrangement, Damien. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that this alliance would build something real between our packs." "And now?" Damien asked. "Now I understand that I was a piece in a larger plan, the same as you were," Serafina said. "My father intended for Ashwood to weaken under the pressure of internal division and external threats, believing that when the moment came, Redwood would be positioned to absorb Ashwood's territory and resources entirely, with me serving as the justification for that absorption." The revelation, though not entirely surprising given the pattern of events, confirmed what Damien had begun suspecting weeks earlier. The alliance he had chosen over Elena, believing it would secure Ashwood's strength and stability, had instead been a carefully orchestrated maneuver designed to weaken his pack from within, using political marriage as a tool of eventual conquest, rather than genuine partnership. "I am sorry," Serafina said, and for the first time, her voice carried genuine remorse, rather than calculated diplomacy. I did not fully understand what I was agreeing to be part of. I think, in some way, I hoped this arrangement could become something real, even knowing how it began. But I see now that it never truly had the chance to be anything more than what my father designed it to be. "What will you do now?" Damien asked. "Return to Redwood," Serafina said. "Confront my father with what I have learned. Whatever comes after that, I do not yet know. But I cannot continue standing beside you, Damien, pretending this alliance is something it was never meant to be." She left Ashwood 3 days later, the formal engagement quietly dissolved by mutual agreement, the political alliance that had once seemed so essential to Ashwood's future, crumbling under the weight of its own hidden intentions. The council, initially concerned about the loss of Redwood's support, found unexpected relief once the full truth of the arrangement became known, recognizing that Ashwood was better positioned without an alliance built on manipulation than it had ever been while trapped within one. Damien stood at the edge of the pack grounds as Serafina's carriage disappeared down the same road Elena had traveled months before, though the feeling settling into his chest this time was entirely different from the heavy loss he had carried after Elena's departure. This time he felt only a quiet, steady relief, and beneath that relief, a growing hope that perhaps, after everything, there might still be a chance to repair what he had broken with his own hands months earlier. He found Elena later that evening, sitting alone near the healer's quarters, watching the sunset paint the sky in deep shades of orange and gold. She looked up as he approached, and this time, neither of them reached for the careful composure that had defined so much of their interactions since her return. "Serafina is gone," Elena said. It was not a question. "The entire alliance was built on manipulation," Damien said, settling down beside her. "Her father intended to weaken Ashwood from within, using the marriage as a means of eventual conquest. I chose an alliance I believed would strengthen my pack, and instead, I nearly handed it directly into the hands of those who sought to destroy it." Elena said nothing for a long moment, processing the weight of what he had shared. "And now?" she finally asked. "Now I understand more clearly than ever what I sacrificed that night in the council hall," Damien said, turning to face her directly. "I chose fear over truth, political strategy over the honesty a real bond demands, and I nearly lost everything because of it, including you." "You did lose me," Elena said quietly. "For months, Damien, I built a life without you. I found peace in the north. I found someone who valued me, without the complications of politics and duty standing between us." "Callum," Damien said, the name feeling heavier than he expected as it left his mouth. "Callum," Elena confirmed. "He is a good man. He never asked me to be anything other than exactly who I am." Damien nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was telling him, even as every instinct urged him to fight for what he had so carelessly thrown away. "I do not expect you to simply forgive me and return to how things were before," he said carefully. "I understand that trust, once broken this deeply, cannot be rebuilt with a single conversation or a single act of courage on a battlefield. But I need you to know, Elena, that whatever you decide, I intend to spend however long it takes proving that the man who rejected you in that council hall was not the man I truly am, or at least, not the man I want to be for the rest of my life." Elena studied him for a long moment, the last light of the sunset casting soft shadows across her face. She did not offer him the forgiveness he sought. Not yet. Not so easily after everything the past months had cost her. But something in her expression softened, just slightly, enough to suggest that the door between them, though far from fully open, was no longer as firmly closed as it had been when she first arrived back at Ashwood to tend the wounded. "I need to return north," she said finally. "I have obligations there, and a life I have built that I am not ready to simply abandon. But I will think about everything you have said, Damien. That is the most I can offer you right now." It was, Damien understood, more than he had any right to expect, and he accepted it gratefully, understanding that whatever came next between them would need to be built slowly, carefully, on a foundation far more honest than the one that had crumbled beneath them months before. Elena returned north 3 days after the battle, carrying with her a heart far more conflicted than the one she had brought south weeks earlier. She had arrived at Ashwood, expecting only to help tend the wounded and return quickly to the quiet life she had built for herself, free of the pain that Pac had once caused her. Instead, she found herself leaving with Damien's words echoing in her mind, unable to fully dismiss the honesty she had heard in his voice as he admitted the truth behind his rejection. Callum noticed the change in her almost immediately upon her return. She was quieter than before, more distracted, her mind clearly occupied with something she had not yet shared with him. He gave her space at first, understanding that whatever she had experienced at Ashwood required time to process. But as the days passed and Elena's distraction did not fade, he finally approached her one evening as they walked together along the familiar path near her uncle's fields. "You have not been the same since you returned," Callum said gently. "Something happened at Ashwood, something beyond tending the wounded." Elena was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "Damien told me he regretted rejecting me," she finally admitted. "He told me the alliance with Serafina had fallen apart, that he understood now what his choice had truly cost him." Callum absorbed this information with quiet grace, though Elena could see the effort it took him to keep his expression steady. "And what do you feel, hearing that?" "I do not know," Elena said honestly. "I have spent months building a life here, away from all of that pain. I found peace. I found you, Callum, and everything you have offered me has been honest and steady in a way I never had at Ashwood. I do not want to throw that away for uncertainty." "But," Callum prompted gently, sensing the word she had left unspoken. "But, I cannot pretend the bond I felt with Damien simply disappeared because he rejected it," Elena admitted. "A true mate bond does not work that way, Callum. I have tried to move past it, and in many ways I have built a life that does not depend on it, but it is still there, quietly, no matter how much I wish it were not." Callum nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her honesty. "I always knew there was a part of your heart I could not fully reach," he said. "I told myself it did not matter, that what we were building together was enough. But I think, deep down, I always understood this day might come. I am sorry," Elena said quietly. "You deserve someone who can give you everything, without any lingering ties to a life left behind." "Do not apologize for your honesty," Callum said. "I would rather know the truth than build something on a foundation that was never fully solid to begin with." He paused, studying her carefully. "What will you do?" "I do not know yet," Elena admitted. "But I think, for the first time since I left Ashwood, I need to figure out what I actually want, rather than simply what feels safe." Callum accepted her honesty with a grace that spoke to the genuine kindness that had drawn her to him in the first place. Their courtship ended gently in the days that followed, without bitterness or blame, both of them understanding that sometimes the right people arrive at the wrong moment, when hearts are not yet free enough to fully commit to something new. Elena spent the following weeks in quiet reflection, tending her garden, continuing her work with her uncle's family, but allowing herself, for the first time since her rejection, to honestly examine what she truly wanted for her future. She thought of the years she had spent at Ashwood, dedicating herself entirely to a role and a bond that had ultimately been discarded in front of an entire council. She thought of the strength she had found in rebuilding her life afterward, proving to herself that her worth had never depended on Damien's acceptance of her. And she thought, too, of the honesty she had witnessed in him during her recent return, the vulnerability he had shown that stood in such stark contrast to the calculated rejection he had delivered months before. She realized, slowly, that the question she needed to answer was not whether she could forgive Damien, but whether she wanted to build something with him that was fundamentally different from what they had before, something built on equal footing rather than her quiet, unquestioning devotion and his position of unchallenged authority. Meanwhile, at Ashwood, Damien threw himself into the work of stabilizing his pack in the aftermath of the failed alliance and the battle that had followed. He worked closely with his council to rebuild trade agreements damaged by Redwood's betrayal, strengthened the pack's eastern defenses to prevent further opportunistic attacks, and began the slow process of restoring the trust his advisors had lost during the turbulent months of Serafina's influence. But even as he focused on these responsibilities, his thoughts returned again and again to Elena, to the conversation they had shared at the edge of the pack grounds, to the uncertainty she had left him with when she returned north. He did not pursue her immediately, understanding that she needed the space to make her own decision, free from any pressure his position or his feelings might place upon her. Instead, he waited, focusing his energy on becoming, in practice rather than simply in words, the kind of leader and the kind of partner who deserved a second chance at the bond he had so carelessly rejected. 2 months passed before Elena returned to Ashwood again, this time not summoned by any crisis, but arriving entirely of her own choosing. She found Damien in the training yard, overseeing a group of young warriors practicing their forms, and she waited patiently at the edge of the field until he noticed her presence. He crossed the distance between them quickly, though he stopped a respectful pace away, giving her the space to speak first. "I have been thinking," Elena said, "about everything that happened between us, about what it would mean to try again, and whether that is even something I truly want." "And what have you decided?" Damien asked, his voice carefully measured despite the hope he could not fully hide. "I have decided that I am willing to try," Elena said. "But not as the woman I was before, not the quiet, dutiful mate who accepted whatever decisions were made without question. If we build something together again, Damien, it will be as equals, with honesty between us from the very beginning, and with the understanding that I will not simply accept silence or rejection ever again, without demanding the truth behind it." "That is more than fair," Damien said. "It is what I should have offered you from the very beginning, 3 years ago, before fear and duty convinced me to choose differently." "I am not offering you my forgiveness yet," Elena continued. "That will take time, and it will need to be earned through action, not simply through words spoken in moments of regret. But I am willing to give you the chance to earn it, if you are willing to put in the work that requires." "I am," Damien said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I am willing." They began slowly, rebuilding their connection through small, honest conversations, rather than grand declarations. Damien made a point of consulting Elena's opinion on matters she had expertise in, treating her perspective as valuable rather than simply decorative, the way he had too often done during their years together before. Elena, in turn, allowed herself to be more open with him than she had ever been before, sharing the fears and doubts she had always kept carefully hidden during her years of quiet devotion. Months passed, and the pack watched with quiet interest as their alpha and the woman he had once publicly rejected slowly, carefully, rebuilt something new between them, something visibly different from the relationship that had crumbled so painfully before. Elena did not return to living quietly in the shadow of Damien's authority. She took on a formal role within the pack's council, her insight and steady judgment earning her genuine respect among the advisors who had once only known her as the alpha's quiet mate. On a clear evening, nearly a year after the night Elena had walked out of the council hall without shedding a single tear, Damien stood before the same gathered council, though this time, the announcement he made carried an entirely different weight. "I have asked Elena Voss to accept the mate bond between us once again," he said, his voice steady and clear, carrying none of the calculated distance it had held during his rejection a year before. "Not because duty or political necessity demands it, but because I have spent this past year learning what it truly means to choose honesty over fear and partnership over convenient silence." Elena stood beside him, her composure as steady as it had been the night she walked away, though this time, the calm in her expression reflected genuine peace rather than carefully guarded pain. When Damien turned to her, offering his hand in front of the entire gathered council, she did not hesitate before taking it. "I accept," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the same hall where his rejection had once silenced an entire room. The council erupted into quiet applause, a stark contrast to the stunned silence that had followed the night Damien first spoke his rejection. Nathaniel, standing near the front of the gathering, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, having watched both Damien and Elena grow through the painful months that had led them to this moment. That evening, as the celebration continued around them, Damien found a quiet moment alone with Elena, near the edge of the pack grounds, close to the same spot where he had once watched her cart disappear down the northern road, uncertain if he would ever see her again. "I never truly understood that night what your silence cost you," he said quietly. "I thought it meant you did not care. It took me far too long to understand that it meant the opposite, that you cared so deeply You refused to let anyone see how badly you were breaking. I learned, during those months alone, that my strength never depended on anyone else's acceptance of me, Elena said. But I also learned that strength does not mean carrying every burden in silence. I am done doing that, Damien. If we are going to build something real together, it will require honesty from both of us, always, even when the truth is difficult. Always, Damien agreed, drawing her gently closer. I promise you that, Elena. Whatever comes, I will not choose fear over truth again. Above them, the stars began to emerge across the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched over Elena's quiet departure a year before, and now watched over a beginning, built not on the fragile foundation of unquestioning devotion, but on something far stronger, forged through pain, honesty, and the hard-earned understanding that the deepest silence often carries the loudest truth of all.